go to the kind of the last section before we go to Q&A, and that is the ongoing role of the board and obviously the committees. And I know a number of folks on the call have joined with that experience already in terms of what they've done so far. The question is what you do from here forward. I'd like to bring a couple things up and then have my fellow panelists also react to some of these. One is, just determining the board committee. The 25 that responded were pretty clear about where this sits. Hopefully that's true for everyone that's joined the call, but it may not be. And what may not be as clear is how you have cross-committee cooperation. So obviously the audit committee has to be very involved in this in terms of the financial disclosures and the assessment of the process, the controls around that and ICFR and all the other things you do in the audit committee. But also you may be managing or overseeing risks in an ESG committee or in a risk committee. And those have to be linked because they're not two different stories. They're obviously different facets of being able to comply with the various rules. And as we've said, raise ourselves above the compliance to the strategy and the risk. Then is the board really prepared? Do they have the right type of expertise on the board? I think NACD, when the comment letters were being sent in, were pretty straightforward that they didn't believe that we had to have specific climate expertise in most instances. It was kind of like with cyber expertise. Do you put a cyber expert on your board or not? But the fact is, it is different. There are various factors that you do have to be educated on. I would recommend a climate governance initiative, which is an initiative with the World Economic Forum that applies the principles associated with the World Economic Forum's climate governance principles. If you look it up, it's listed climate-governance.org. Anyway, it's a great source for boards. It's also a partner with NACD in terms of being able to drill much deeper into what should you have in terms of expertise on the board. And then the shift from voluntary to mandatory, does it prompt the organization to reassess its goals and transition strategies? I think you heard from Jan, they're set. They've been doing this since 19 and they're moving forward. Some companies may say, "Ooh, we got a bit over our skis. We may need to pull back or we may need to reassess." I think the important thing is really, as Jan mentioned, being able to have targets set, but also milestones. And for the board to understand what are our milestones along the way. We can't just say, 2040 and that's it. We need to have checkpoints along the way. We need to have sub-goals or sub-targets, if you will, along the way. And many companies have gotten themselves into trouble with greenwashing, for example, where they put up big goals, but there's nothing in between in terms of how are we actually going to meet those goals. So it's important for the board to ask those questions and understand what's the story. And then how do we integrate and leverage disclosure requirements into our long-term strategy, risk, and value creation? So those are some of the things kind of I think for boards to consider, questions that boards should ask. So I'm going to ask in no particular order, my fellow panelists. I mean, Jan, you mentioned about how your board has been very involved along the way. How do you think that if it does change from here forward, does it continue as it is? Do they get deeper into some of the things, particularly around climate risk that we've discussed? How do you see that changing?
So we've been very fortunate. As I said, we established an ESG risk committee of the board in 2021. And it was in advance of knowing that we were going to put climate central to our 22 to 24 company strategy and ongoing into the future. So that was a very intentional set of discussions and decisions that the board made together with our management team at that point in time. The construction of the committee is a board chair who is a very seasoned veteran of our industry. So has a very strong risk background and is very, very curious and interested and knowledgeable in the broad ESG space, including the climate space. So we're very fortunate in that regard. And the construction of the committee is actually the committee chairs of the other committees. So it's a focused committee with Nom and Gov and Audit, HRCC committee chairs being there, as well as our lead independent director. Now, the interesting thing that has occurred over the 3-year period of time is that actually our whole board ends up deciding to go attend the committee meeting. And so while it's focused from a governance perspective around that committee, the engagement by the full board is routine to be informed and engaged and knowledgeable in the discussion. So that's actually been over the course of the past, I'd say, 1.5 years. That's where it's evolved to, and that's been a really meaningful and helpful, constructive process for us. We have been doing TCFD analysis and reporting for the past couple of years as well. Given the business that Jacobs is in, doing that TCFD reporting is a very, very interesting and dynamic thing to go assess. We have some additional work. You asked about our gaps. We have some additional work to complete that out for the client sectors and markets that we play in, because that's where our significant risk really is for the going concern of the company. How are we going to continue generating revenue as a professional services firm, largely? How is that really going to work? What do we see climate impacting those clients and their industries and where they are in the world? So that's one big integrated discussion that we have. And so the board has been exposed to the climate risk conversation so far. We have some work to do to integrate that with the broader enterprise risk discussions to integrate that more fully. But I think we're in a good place there. The other piece for us that will inevitably occur as we think about fully integrating this to the next iteration of the strategy going forward is, where does M&A come into play for us? And how do we purposefully and intentionally integrate these kinds of assessments into that due diligence process, so we understand who we might be considering acquiring, where is their footprint? Where are they located around the world? What kinds of jurisdictions are they going to be succumbing to from a reporting perspective as we think about that in this timeline, especially this near and midterm timeline? And then, Barbara, to your point, what's that longer term timeline we want to integrate all of this into over the course of time?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point you just made, Jan, on M&A, because I suspect your due diligence has changed as well in terms of understanding that element, what they've done so far, the messaging they have, the controls, everything all the way down.
Yeah,
so
that is very significant and increasing.
Absolutely. So Nicole, maybe some thoughts from you, same question relative to how your board has been engaged, how you see that engagement here forward. Perhaps just tell us a little bit too about maybe any expertise or sort of things that, elements that you could see perhaps increasing on the board now that we've got the this rulemaking.
Yeah, sure. So a few years back, we added a and responsibility to our nominating and governance committee, so that at that point they became officially responsible for ESG from a risk monitoring standpoint. ESG has been, one of our 4 sort of strategic pillars as a company. So it's been a focus area for sure, but definitely getting more and more attention at the board level. We're a consumer products company, so our consumers care. It's necessary for our business, right? That we care if we want to continue to sell products to those same consumers. And I mentioned already being, agriculture company, when we think about our footprint, we think about our suppliers' footprints. Jan mentioned the complexity of having to think about clients and what their footprint is. And we have suppliers for, grapes, hops, barley, all sorts of ingredients across the globe that we're also thinking about. So I think from how the board is looking at things, definitely the risk piece of it is on the table, but for us as a company, it's kind of getting that maturity and looking at that risk profile that we're still playing a little bit of catch up. Like it's a focus area, but we're really truly trying to define our full value chain and figure out what that means for that longer term risk profile. With the mandatory reporting requirements, the audit committee is also very focused on this. So, back before the rule came out, we were getting questions here and there from the audit committee. Then the proposed SEC rule came out, sparked some more questions. So we've been in regular communication with the audit committee to try to make sure that we're communicating how we are preparing from a reporting standpoint. But you definitely get those crossover questions about what does that mean for us as a company and the risk. So I think our biggest challenge is really trying to make sure that there's enough communication between the committees so that we're asking and answering all of those questions, whichever angle we're coming at it from.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily something that comes easily, because, some companies that I've, been on the board of, their charters actually call for cross-committee cooperation. I mean, they may call it out. Like one of the areas I've seen that is particularly related to technology, like SCADA systems, maybe overseen by a different committee than perhaps, some of the financial systems, like in the audit committee, but you may have an HSSE committee that oversees SCADA. So things like that may be called out. Other things may just be course of business. So I think in this case, when you got something new like this, it was the same thing for cyber. I think being able to really understand and articulate. So, I mean, you don't have to have it in the charter, but just so everybody understands where the responsibilities and accountabilities, and that calls for all the way from the management to the board, to the committees, so you don't drop anything. So Maura, I'm going to ask you, advice for directors. I mean, you've seen a lot of companies, you're consulting with companies in terms of have been now for some time. What are you seeing? What's kind of the best advice you can give the directors? What are some of the red flags sort of that they should watch out for as they're thinking about oversight and preparedness and making sure that the ball doesn't get dropped?
I think one of the trickiest things that we're talking about right now is materiality. Particularly with CSRD, there's the concept of double materiality that you mentioned, which is very different from SEC materiality. Even though we are talking about financial materiality under CSRD, it's still not quite the same. And so there's going to be a lot of confusion, I think, across the board at management level, at the board level. And so having robust discussions around that, really digging in with the legal team, with your auditors, with the accountants, and trying to understand that landscape, and then being able to put all of the different pieces of the disclosure in the right bucket so that you're saying the right things at the right time, I think is one of those areas that will need some attention in the near term. The second area is really going to be around financial impact. Some of you may have been involved in this. I know we as an audit firm, it's been raised to us, but the past 3 years, there's been an organization that's been issuing a report called Flying Blind, and just a lot of criticism of companies for not incorporating into their estimates and assumptions consideration of climate, and then criticism of the auditors for not calling that out as part of their CAMs and as part of the work that we do. And historically, the argument has been, well, all of these things are relatively near term. The methodologies aren't built that way. The curves aren't built that way to consider all of this information, and therefore we haven't raised it, and that's why it's not currently being disclosed. I think with the SEC rule coming into play and a brighter light being shown on estimates, assumptions, the potential use of scenario analysis going forward by organizations. As an example, if you're talking about what does your long-term strategy around products and services look like, and you're doing a scenario analysis to say, we're going to make an investment in this area and we're going to start building out a product line here, and revenues are going to come from that product line. When you do evaluation for an acquisition or an impairment analysis, you look at future cash flows of revenues. if you have a mismatch in terms of those revenues, revenue projections, that could be an issue, right? And so those estimates and assumptions for your scenario analysis are going to have to be disclosed if they're material in the front half of the K, and then the expectation is that will flow through any financial impact, whether it's directly related to the scenario analysis or not. And so there's an area that I would flag for audit committees, and the financial review, the financial statements, and the financial reporting in general.
That's great. Yeah, I mean that the valuation issue can be a big one, right? In terms of being able to have different views of the world. It's like one of the things that I always think is there's one version of the truth. Now it's all about estimates and judgments, but they need to be consistent. And this is an area that perhaps will will really play that out if not. But let me ask you this, and I'm going to kind of go around in terms of how directors get smart on this area. I mentioned climate governance initiative. Obviously, all the firms, obviously, KPMG, Maura, you guys putting out some pretty incredible. You put out something in September 2023 that I remember on climate governance, on what boards need to do, and it was very comprehensive around talent and physical risks. But maybe kind of go around. I'll start with you, Maura, in terms of how can directors be educated in this area? What are some of the things they should be thinking about?
Well, two of the tools that I would mention, and this may be what you're thinking about, Barbara, is we've actually developed handbooks for climate risk in the financial statements and for greenhouse gas emissions. And so they mirror what we have put out for business combinations and leases and revenue and things like that. What I like about our climate risk in the financials handbook is that it almost can serve as a checklist for you to address some of those risks that I was talking about, but it does give you some of the basics in terms of what is physical risk, what is transition risk, how do I think about it. Similarly, on the greenhouse gas emissions, it lays out what are scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, what could the sources be, what are emissions factors, but then it goes into a lot more detail as well in terms of how to apply it. So probably more than boards need, but certainly good places, things to share with management and sort of looking at the executive summaries to get, high level considerations. We also have developed an ESG Academy and a number of other types of educational courses that folks have access to at varying levels of detail, I would say, that cover the broad spectrum. And this is something that we actually put a lot of our people through within KPMG. We've spent probably 60,000 hours on training at this point just to understand the landscape around ESG. Like, how do we think about climate why is climate even so important, right? How do we think about it in the context of our businesses? What does sustainable finance mean? What are some of the tools that are being used? So thinking about what those hot topics are, or kind of the buzzwords, and then understanding what they mean and finding material and training around them. Like, what is a transition plan? What does that even mean? What is a scenario analysis? There's a lot of words out there. There are a lot of different definitions too, but they all have to be applied. So, getting that baseline understanding is really critical.
Yeah, and there's a lot of acronyms too, which you got to keep going back. You made me think of something too. I mentioned the Climate Governance Initiative, but a publication that I read is Environmental Finance, and it's pretty interesting. It's really all about things that are being done in terms of financial, Jan, you mentioned bonds, but, various elements around the world in terms of who's investing in what, and, where are some of the, project finance that's going on. And that I find it's interesting because it's all at the end of the day linked to economics in some way. And so it's sort of, it may be a little bit too much, right? But it informs you of things that are going on around the world. So Jan,
that's another thing, Barbara, just real quick, there are so many tax opportunities now, particularly in the US, that you can take advantage of. And, they're structured very complexly because that's what we love to do. But you can get cash out from a lot of these structures today to be able to support your initiatives as you go. And so being creative about financing, I think that's actually it's been a big hole in a lot of sustainability programs up until recently, and I think it still exists, which is that sustainability professionals have not necessarily had the ability, the bandwidth, the capacity, or even the methodologies to be able to understand what the return on investment is in a lot of these areas. But we're starting to be able to see that now, both because we have more carbon taxes, we have more tax incentives, and there's just more data available.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've never seen anything. I mean, I serve on the board of Pattern. Now we're building what's the largest infrastructure project in the Western Hemisphere, which is a wind farm, 3.5 gigawatt, and a transmission line to deliver wind energy to California and Arizona. And some of the financing structures are just extremely complicated, but so are the tax incentives under IRA. And to your point, making sure you get everything that you can under those programs. So Jan, obviously you got a great relationship with your board. You've been bringing them along and they've been, involved in this from the get-go, but any advice to these directors in terms of maybe ways they can educate themselves, or maybe things you're using with your board or you're using yourself in your group?
I think there are a couple of things. We have partnered with the Royal Scottish Geographic Society for a number of years. They actually have a really nice, basic, and comprehensive grounding for anybody in the world to actually get a grounding around climate. What does it mean? How's policy developed? Where is that going, et cetera? So that's just a nice broad thing for any person, any practitioner, and we offer it to all of our board members. We offer it to our entire employee workforce and to our clients as well. We have done in the past, when we kicked things off with the ESG Risk Committee, we actually had a very fulsome board education session around what was going on in the world of sustainability, broader ESG and climate, and used that as a grounding for our entire board at that point in time. There are snippets that we will bring in special outside speakers on topical basis to come in and actually brief the board periodically. And we are now with what's happening in the world of CSRD and potentially CSDDD and in the EU, if that gets passed by Parliament before they go and get replaced in their election that's upcoming. What's going on with California, et cetera. We're about ready to do another full board education session, partly because it's important to understand the grounding of what's happening around the globe that we're playing in, and have that consideration, but how all of these things play out with our industry and helping our board have that industry lens of how we need to consider that and the kinds of challenges it means for us and our client base, given who we actually go serve, is something that we feel we can do in a bespoke way, partnered with some outside firms to create a specific board education session for them on a fairly routine basis.
That's great. Thanks, Jan. And Nicole, anything to add to that? I know we have one question, so we'll go to that after we hear from you on Director.
Sure. Yeah, so I'll echo what Jan said, is like, as board members, like, ask your company to provide you with those education opportunities at the board level, because there are a lot of folks that are sort of helping the management team understand things and would be more than happy to make sure that the board is informed and helping do the right things from a governance standpoint. And then I will just say, like, maybe on a less formal basis, I personally find that podcasts are very helpful. All the accounting firms, if you're looking from the guidance side, have them. They're also getting more into just the operational aspects of, like, what is a greenhouse gas emission and what does all of this mean, right? So if you're looking to get kind of baseline understandings, that's a very, like, low effort way, in my opinion, to kind of listen on your commute or whatever else that just might be able to supplement some of the more formal activities.
Oh, that's great. I serve on the board of Arcadis in Amsterdam, and we're a design and engineering firm that just works in sustainable projects. And one of the things we're doing from the board is spending a lot of time understanding those projects we're doing in climate adaptation, water projects in terms of working in erosion, working in smart cities. I find that when you use those sort of examples, people really begin to understand the practical implication. And then obviously, that's obviously an opportunity and a risk for the company because, it implies different capital, implies different talent, all those things. So that's very helpful.